Hi, very good morning, and welcome to all of you who are joining the session today on this new unit that we are starting with, strategic human resource management. In today's session, I'm going to lay down some guidelines in terms of, obviously the aim and objectives of the unit, and in terms of how we will cover this. And the second part, I'm going to be concentrating on running through a deck of slides wherein we will discuss the learning outcome 1 and some of the task and assessment criteria related to learning outcome 1. This is quite an interesting unit. Obviously, over the years, the human resources management as a function has grown tremendously, and there are lots of things that are happening in our lifetime in terms of globalization, workforce diversity, and the role of HR in organizations has become quite important. It is generally being seen as a role which is being seen as a secondary role within the organization, as a cost center, some of us know. But with the increasing, let's put it this way, the increasing diversity of workforce now working within organizations, the role of HR managers has become quite important. And here, what we're going to do today is also briefly, before we get into the discussions, we'll also look at what were the traditional roles of HR and how that has changed over the years, wherein this role has also become strategic in nature, and that is what we're going to study in terms of strategic HRM. The first learning outcome actually covers a lot of interesting things. We'll get into that. So let's start off with, understanding the aims and objective, of, studying this particular unit at level 7. So you should be able to see my screen now, and I've put together a few slides that we will be discussing and going through. Now, the aim and objective of this particular unit is to, help learners develop an effective understanding, basically a good understanding of, what is the purpose and role of SHRM, or strategic human resource management, within modern day organizations today. During the course of the discussion, I'm going to be taking up an example of Tesco, which is a large retailer in the UK and has operations both in the UK and in other countries globally. Now, the key things that you will learn would be to look at understanding and evaluating the contribution of SHRM and its application to leadership and management with regards to an organization. At level 7, this unit will not just focus on obviously developing fundamentals and giving you the knowledge into this particular subject, but the idea would be, apart from getting knowledge in this subject area, would be to look at how do we effectively apply some of the principles, the models of SHRM while you work within different companies or organizations across the world. Now, let's get into, before we start the unit, let's look at some of the traditional things like, what is the definition of SHRM? Now, strategic human resource management has long, been associated with, when I look at defining the word strategy, business, and also, HRM. So let's look at these three terms differently to understand the meaning of these three terms first, and then we'll come to the definition of, strategic HRM. Now, when you look at the, the definition of business strategy or business and strategy, now this is a process through which the organization actually defines its long-term goals and objectives, and then creates policies and processes around which that these goals and objectives can be achieved by the employees or the staff workers within the organization. Now, the whole idea of essentially looking at creating a business strategy is to develop a coherent framework so that everybody in the organization, every worker working within the organization, is actually singing from the same hymn sheet. And this becomes an overarching document, which basically could be a high-level document or an overarching document which clearly defines the goals and the objectives which the company is looking at achieving. And when I look at going into a bit more detail, it also means that here with this document, which is created within the organization, you're looking at understanding the requirements and interest of a range of stakeholders which are related to the organization of the business. So the stakeholders could be, shareholders, it could be customers, suppliers, it could be employees, it could be also the environment, the government, And these stakeholders, we have to understand their aims, and we have to basically understand their requirements and marry it with the aims and objectives before this strategy document is created. Now, once this document is created, it kind of becomes a sustainable framework for moving the organization forward. And in this framework, it is important to say that every stakeholder has some shared value. That means the business activities which the organization does to create value, whether it's in terms of product, services, or in terms of profits for the different stakeholders. All the stakeholders have some sort of a vested interest into this particular plan. Now, when I take this further, what we are looking at is that from an HRM point of view, we are looking at the role of human resources management, which is going to be aligned to be able to achieve this particular business strategy for the organization. So here the organizations must define their own unique strategy, which is related to their culture, their organization, and to a certain extent the objectives which it wants to achieve. And the aligning of this strategy with regards to marrying it with the people side of things within the organization, to look at structure of the organization, look at the culture of the organization, and overall how this is going to be managed is the role of HRM. So strategic HRM would then be looking at how do HR professionals essentially look at applying the business side of things in terms of strategy, and marry it with the organizational structure, culture, the persona, or the way the organization portrays itself in the market, to be able to effectively utilize the human resources capital to help achieve the objectives of the organization. Now, if I go back now to the definition of strategic HRM, what we can clearly say is that the SHRM as a function basically looks at supporting the long-term goals or long-term business goals, essentially, of the organization, and it marries the it marries basically the function of the human resources into that strategic framework, so that the organization is able to achieve the objectives. So very literally, if I have to say this, the HR looks at deploying the best possible resources that it will require for achieving that particular strategy. So if there are a number of employees and the objectives for the organization is set, the HR's role is basically to look at identifying individuals who will be perfect in terms of working in those job roles, so that the organization at the end of the year or at the end of the business cycle is able to achieve those objectives, achieve those sales targets, or achieve whatever has been set as a target by the management. So this concept of HRM, which was initially developed, SHRM, which was initially developed in the 1990s, has made a distinction because it basically combines the HR function of strategic planning, as we say, human resources planning, and marries the company strategy into this particular role of SHRM. Now, what we are looking at is the SHRM is more oriented towards understanding how the human resources side of things are working in relation to business strategy, and the performance of its resources in terms of human capital resources, people, is looking at that aspect as against the operational aspects of the traditional HR, looking at training and development, recruitment, selection, and things like that. So here, the main focus of SHRM is primarily to look at driving forward the business strategy of the organization, and to identify and best provide the human resources which will help in achieving that particular objective set by the organization. So when it comes to looking at sales, the HR managers would look at identifying the best HR salespeople within the organization, incentivize them, put across various perks, emoluments, and you look at incentives and rewards in place, so that they are, in short, providing a conducive atmosphere and motivation to be able to achieve those sales targets which are set by the organization. Now, their aim is to look at continuously identifying the performance with which the target set, and looking at how they can be bettered, or how they can be achieved from a standpoint of view of the organization. So the HRM function, looks after traditional functions within the organization, and the SHRM would primarily look at I would say the strategic side of things, which is marrying the strategy and the planning of the organization with human resources to be able to best achieve the performance desired or set by or the performance required, which is set by in terms of the objectives by the management or the board of the organization. Now, having said that, let's look at very briefly a slide to understand, what are the traditional differences or what are the differences between traditional HR functions and SHRM. Now, if I look at this particular table, here the HR looks at, administrating, the manpower. That means they manage human resources functions in terms of, various activities like payroll, training development. You look at, appraisals and things like that. SHRM would look at managing and in some cases directing employees to make sure that they are able to fulfill the organizational goal. To give you an example here would be that when you look at people working within the administration department, a lot of them are working within the administration department and they have their usual roles and responsibility to go about. So things like if I look at the HR side of things, somebody would be looking after managing payroll, somebody would be looking at managing, appraisals, somebody would be looking at managing training and development, unions and other bits, and, industrial relations and things like that. The SHRM side of function within that department will be basically looking at how much is the, payroll or the wage bill for the organization in a month, which people are at what, salaries or wages, and how much are they contributing towards the achievement of goals and objectives of the organization. So here, their role is looking into more critically, the side of human resources to see and evaluate how they would possibly be able to, say, for example, reduce the wage bill or maybe incentivize people who are not performing to be able to see that they're able to more closely perform and also relate to and help in achievement of the organizational goal. Now, HR behavior normally seems to be reactive, but SHRM seems to be proactive. Reactive in the sense that, you're basically looking at dealing with normal day-to-day operations. So in some cases, you're going to react if there's a situation which arises. But the strategic side of HRM looks at, being proactive so that you are able to see or foresee changes happening, 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, 3 years in advance. So when we look at a change which is now more or less got set into a lot of these millennial organizations is that they allow flexibility in terms of working from home. Now, this is something which is a trend which has been identified by the strategic side of things within HRM, is that as long as the employees are able to work and contribute towards the meeting of their objectives or goals set by the organization, the place of work could be made flexible, which allows the employee or the staff to be in a natural working environment and generally promotes more efficiency and productivity. Now, this is proactive side of things to look at reading into the future and seeing that, this might be a requirement which will be coming in because as the workforce becomes quite distributed, quite diverse, and in some cases, it is quite diverse because you're employing people from different geographies. You need to have that approach wherein the approach has to be proactive. And in this case, proactive means allowing employees to work from home. Now, some of the other things that we look at is when you look at approach of HR, it's slightly disjointed. That means the training department is working. Yes, it is an HR function, but they're working in isolation. Sometimes you see payroll working in isolation. Sometimes you see appraisals working in isolation. But when you look at the concept of SHRM, they are seen, the person who's responsible for driving the HR strategy or the strategic side of functions within the organization will see it as a cohesive function. That means they will seek interconnectivity between all the different functions of the various, traditional HR functions which the department actually oversees. So if they pick up that the employee performance is not going as per what is described in the job description role or in terms of the required output which is expected, they would then put that person into go through an appraisal process, look at identifying gaps, and if those gaps have to be removed, they might decide to put them into training and development. When the training and development is done and the employee then gains the relevant skills, they are then able to perform well. So they see it as a cohesive function, and you will see that in a SHRM side of things, the approach is more cohesive, looking at all the functions to see which one is going to help the employee to actually perform related to the organizational objectives. So some of these things over the years have got differentiated, and you look at, HR looks at short-term, strategic HR looks at short-term, medium-term, and even long-term. Now, the concerns with regards to, HR are capital and products. You look at always minimizing cost and, what is the best cost the HR side of things could manage in terms of payroll and wages. But in the SHRM side of things, they look at people as capital resources, and in that case, they want to retain the best possible staff, which has the knowledge and experience gained within the organization, which could be put to use in other projects or in other areas of the organization. So, as you see, the function of HR. If I go through this table in detail, but yeah, the function of HR and the role of SHRM is, easily differentiable when we look at some of these things in regards to comparison parameters. Now, any questions, please feel free to ask me to the chat room, and I'll take them as they come along. Now, let's also look at, the different types of models of human resources management, which have been proposed and over the years have evolved. And so let's look at briefly going through some of these models. Now, I have put together some 3 or 4 slides to talk about the models here primarily, but I will be able to send you a supplementary document which defines and discusses some of these models in a bit more detail. And the reason why I say that is that it might be worthwhile for you to read that handout and study that in a bit more detail, because that will allow you to get deeper understanding into why these models were developed. Now, there are a number of models which obviously have been postulated, and these by various basically scholars, and they define the concept of human resources management. Now, what we've seen is there have been a lot of variations over the years, and there were 2 approaches which initially developed, which was the soft and the hard approach of HRM. And over the years, some of these models have now gone and developed that approach a bit further. One of the models that we look at in particular, if I have to look at that first, would be the model of, Harvard model. Now, the main reason Harvard, kind of postulated this particular model in 1984 was that he basically coined the, he basically acknowledged the existence of multiple stakeholders within the organization. So at some stage, when the business works within the market, provides products and services, or sells products and services, there are different stakeholders which are involved. And these multiple stakeholders, could be employees, government, it could be unions, it could be management, shareholders, and things like that. Now, this particular model looks at focusing on the soft side of HRM. That means this model emphasizes more on the fact that employees, like any other shareholders, are equally important in influencing, I would say the organizational outcomes. So in this case, what he looked at was that the creation of business strategies can be successfully done if some of these factors are looked at while creating this particular while creating the strategy. So he looked at stakeholders' interests, he looked at situational factors which could be internal, external. Then he looked at marrying them with the HR policies and what are the outcomes that it can generate, and what could be the long-term consequences of these strategies for the organization. Now, going further, what we also look at is that sometimes when we look at the concept of human resources management, he basically defined that employees' influence is recognized through motivation, through people motivation, and the development of organizational culture is based on mutual trust and teamwork. Now, these factors need to be taken into the HR strategy, which then is seen in the HR flows, the reward systems, the incentives which are put in place so that employees are motivated to be able to achieve the organizational goals and objective. Now, let's put it this way, that sometimes when we look at the Harvard model, it is premised on the belief that the organizational human resources give a competitive advantage through treating them as assets and not as costs. And that is falling back onto the basic definition of soft HRM. Is that okay? Now let's go across and look at the matching model, of HRM. Just briefly understanding the matching model. Now the matching model was actually, developed by a couple of scholars, which included Formbrun, Tichy, and Divana. And here, what they did was this is also called the Michigan model, and they basically were from the Michigan Business School. So this model is also called, obviously, the Michigan Business Model because they developed it while, obviously coming across from the business school. Now, in this case, what they look at is they look at, this particular model looks at basically, matching the aspect of, let's put it this way, the HRM to the harder side of hard HRM that we look at. So Harvard model focused on soft. That means they looked at placing good amount of emphasis on employees. Here, this side of model basically looks at, a tight fit or the hard HRM and is basically inclined towards that. Now, it basically says that human resources must be matched with the jobs in the organization. So if they basically propose that the selection, when it is done, it needs to be based on the basis of, it needs to be having a basis on performance, and then performance should be commensurate to rewards which are provided to the individuals because they are able to contribute, in terms of variability for meeting the objectives of the organization. So given an example here, you have two sales managers and somebody who's contributing £1 million in terms of the sales turnover and somebody who's contributing £500,000. The performance of the two sales managers is different, and in this case the rewards and the incentives provided to the two sales managers should also be different. And here what it also proposes is that the performance of the other individual can be enhanced by providing development, and then again measurement of that needs to be done to be able to ensure that the rewards are commensurate to what the achievement of or contribution of the individual is towards the organizational goal. Now here what they basically meant was that in terms of the HR strategy, you have to be highly calculated in terms of the quantity of human resources required to achieve the objectives which are kind of enshrined in the business strategy. That means that you are looking at, if the target this year is higher as compared to last year, and you're looking at achieving a higher goal, then sometimes you'll have to employ more sales managers or more resources to be able to achieve that target, and that has to be correctly balanced in order for the business strategy to achieve its goals and objectives. So here the business strategy takes a central stage, and that is why the human resources are to be taken in line with any other resource, which must be fully utilized with regards to achieving or trying to achieve the organizational objectives. So here in terms of this particular model, this looks at basically the hard side of HRM, and it treats human resources as any other resource within the organization, and it strongly indicates or says that the resources should be commensurate to the performance or the output required from the organization. Now, the third model that we will look at primarily is called the guest model. And in the guest model, what we look at is there is a bit of a fusion of the aspect of both the hard and soft approach of HRM. So here, David Guest essentially in the 1987 actually proposed that there are 4 individual components that underpin organizational effectiveness. Now, the 4 individual components he talked about was strategic integration, which means there is an ability of the organization to maintain a fit between the HR strategy and the business strategy. Then the second bit that he proposed was flexibility, and in flexibility he talked about the basic ability of the organization and its people to adapt to the changing business and work environment and the capacity to manage innovation. In the third side, he talked about high commitment, and in this case he mentioned that there is a need for both behavioral commitment which is basically the ability to go an extra mile or travel an extra mile, and the attitudinal commitment, which is basically reflected in the strong identification within the organization. And the fourth pillar that he basically mentioned was, or the fourth point that he mentioned was quality. Now, he said quality is based on the assumption that you are looking at provisioning for high quality goods and services as a result of managing people within the organization. So these four, I would say, crucial pillars or components is what he proposed in the guest model of HRM, and he basically said that these four pillars, are important for the organization to be able to achieve, performance and achieve its business objectives, and they are all interrelated. So if you have the strategic integration of business strategy and HR strategy, leading to high commitment in terms of HR practices, that being quality controlled to monitor, the performance, the training and development, and the output of the individuals, and giving them the flexibility to be able to produce and deliver these quality goods and services, leads to the organization achieving its, business objectives or financial objectives or performance set in the organization. So, apart from this, there are lots of other models which have, come about over the years, and there are models which, were proposed by Ulrich, which is the three-legged stool model. And what I'm going to be able to do is, try and basically send you a handout which talks about these models in a bit more detail, so that you have a good understanding in terms of, the different models over the years as they have developed, and then developed into the role of defining basically the HR framework within the organization, and the basic working of the HR framework within the organization. Now let's look at briefly some of the tasks which are given. Now I put some slides together to discuss some of these tasks, because after understanding, let's also briefly look at, before we get into the tasks, let's also understand the various functions of or the roles of HR. Now, when we look at the traditional functions of HR, we look at things like recruitment, selection, resourcing. We look at basically design and development, learning and development within the organization. We look at basically transformation in some cases. You look at when organizations merge, there's a merger and acquisition, there's a change which has to be brought in, or for example, if there's a major change which is coming in terms of how the organization is reinventing itself. Change management and business transformation is also a part of HR function. We look at the management of performance and appraisals, and also behavior management, which falls within the HR and is one of the key functions. HR also manages the employee and industrial relations, which is to do with dealing with unions and different laws and legislation related to HR. We also look at HR is now increasingly also having to produce metrics or reports, which provides a snapshot of how the HR side of things are working within the organization in terms of management of data. We look at rewards, compensations, and benefit management. When we talk about incentives, we talk about bonuses, we talk about employee stock option plans, we talk about reward management. All these are a part of obviously the HR department. And then training and development. So training and development is seen as a very key function to within large organizations, especially to try and maintain and retain the staff from a perspective of maintaining competitive edge, and also to retain the right talent within the organization. Now let's look at, in this particular task, we are looking at understanding what is the importance of SHRM within the organization. Now we clearly know that the human resources function is focused on primarily at traditional activities like recruitment, selection, management, performance appraisal, training and development. Now the SHRM side of things is basically linking the HR resources with the objectives and goals set within the business strategy document of the organization. And their role is to look at how the HR or human resources capital, people working, workforce, staff working within the organization is actually able to support the achievement of that particular goal and objectives, from an organizational standpoint of view. Now, they are involved in the HR side of things, but they are also involved in implementing the strategies which are closely connected to the business strategy for recruiting, selection, training, and rewarding the personnel. So sometimes you will see that somebody within the HR function is basically looking at managing certain side of things, which are looking at giving differentiated incentives to people depending on the performance of their depending on their performance within the organization and their contribution to the goals and objectives. And a simple situation that I would normally give within this, an example in this situation would be to look at when you have different salespeople within the organization, you have different sales managers. Sometimes you will see that the reward creation or the incentive creation in terms of policies is done at a differentiated level, so that if you're achieving 100%, you get an X bonus. You achieve 110%, you get X, Y bonus. You achieve 125%, you get Z bonus. And if you achieve 150 and over in terms of your sales targets, you get certain incentives, and also maybe a trip to a holiday destination, or some other incentives which clearly differentiates the performance that you've done for the organization. So here, basically, when we look at the importance of SHRM, the idea here is to improve and increase the employee skills by focusing on the business problems that are outside the control of human resources. So these actions which the SHRM actually takes are basically related to increasing productivity, efficiency, driving motivation, and loyalty towards the organization. Now, sometimes we also look at that it is sometimes easy to justify, but also sometimes it's difficult to understand why the role of SHRM is becoming more important within the organization. Now, when we look at this, there are clearly some factors which are driving this. Now, some of these factors include, we are looking at globalization. The increasing globalization would mean a lot of companies which have operation in different countries have to look at now different types of working with different types of employees or workforce. They have to have different policies which are adapted to the individual geography or country. They have to obey certain law and legislation which is related to primarily human resources. And in some cases, because of the climate and context in which they operate, you have to look at localized strategies which need to be implemented for reward management, or for example performance management, and also to look at recruitment and selection. So some of these factors which actually help in clearly differentiating the role of HR and take it into the remit of SHRM is because of globalization and increasing technological change. We are looking at cross-cultural factors, which is workforce diversity essentially, and then the economic trends which are basically transferring, I would say, leading to the transfer of technology, which is basically creating manufacturing and employment opportunities from developed to the developing countries. And these are the reasons why the role of SHRM is becoming much more important in organizations which are predominantly working in a global context or have operations in different countries. So it is important for the organization to have somebody employed within this function which understands how to align the business, how to align basically the human resources side of things, which is staff, workforce, employees, whatever you call it, with the business strategy side of things, and then implement them according to the various demographic trends and the labor markets in order for the business to be successful. Now let's look at some of the other things related to the second, systemic idea, which is looking at, the role and purpose of SHRM in the activities of an organization. Now, so far, you've understood that why SHRM is different from the traditional HR functions. Now, we will also say that SHRM is looking at basically, in some cases, providing leadership and management at a higher level than the traditional HR function within an organization. So if I assume, and if I ask you to kind of now look at the example of, say, a company which works across borders or has operations in different countries, let's look at the example of Tesco. Here, what we do get to see, what we get to see is that particular side of operations, which is not just in the UK, but in other countries like Turkey, Italy, Germany, and some of the other countries, there the SHRM, the strategic role of human resources management, is actually seen in action. Now, we will discuss this with a bit of an example, but what it does is that sometimes the role of strategy in particular within the role of HR becomes important, is because the strategic side of things is focused, as we looked at, long term. What they are able to see is pick out the trends or pick out the factors which are going to be important if there are changes coming, if there are regulations coming, or for example, in this case, if Brexit is happening, what you will see is that Tesco needs to align some of its human resources policies, which are going to be different from what they implement in UK than in some of the other countries in Europe, wherein the companies having operations. So the SHRM side of things will be looking at developing strategies, or looking at changes which will be required from a business perspective, in order to continue to function in those countries, even when Britain, and the head office, obviously, because Tesco is a UK-based company, so the head office being in the UK, even though when we leave the European Union, some of these aspects of policies, practices, when you look at resources, but they will still continue to work, and somebody has to think strategically from that point of view, that how these will need to be kind of tailored, changed, amended to suit the local geography or the workings within the European Union when Britain comes out of EU. So the overall purpose is basically looking at the corporate objectives and marrying that with the resources dimension from a strategic point of view to basically drive some of these activities further. Now, this process, when you look at developing strategy, say for example the business strategy which has been developed, like most companies in the UK now are working on strategies to say, if we do leave the EU without a deal with the European Union, then they are working on a contingency plan, and this contingency plan would be related to human resources, it would be related to finances, capital, it could be related to operations, manufacturing, and a lot of other things which will affect the business. So in order for them to come up with a strategy, the organization looks at explicitly considering various dimensions which are going to actually affect its business once Britain leaves the EU. And this is a responsibility which basically sits with the SHRM, or the strategy side of human resources management, and their responsibility will be to look at clearly identifying and understanding the impact of some of the social, political, technological factors which will affect the business, or it will affect the ability of the organization to do business in some of these countries. Now let's look at Tesco. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when we look at Tesco, the reason why we've chosen Tesco, to give you a bit of a background, is that Tesco is primarily, so let me just bring this slide forward. So we are taking an example of Tesco. And the reason why we've taken an example of Tesco is that Tesco employs over 240,000 employees, in the UK market alone. It is one of the largest, retailers in terms of market size. I think it holds about 29% market share in terms of the UK retailing market. Now, over the last few years, they've undergone a lot of transition. There was a scandal which was reported that Tesco was over-reporting, its profits, so they've been fined, and because of which there is a lot of reorganization which has happened within the company. Now, this reorganization is focused on ensuring that some of these things do not happen again within the organization, and its reporting of accounts at the end of the year. Now, needless to say, there's a reorganization which has also happened within the HR side of things, and the HR side of things have been streamlined in terms of, because the over-reporting of results at the senior management level, which is at the CFO level, CEO level, primarily happened because maybe they were driven by incentives or motivations to get higher incentives for themselves by reporting higher profits. So there is a change which has now been implemented from a point of view of HR, and to look at making changes like the remuneration of the top CX the management, CXO kind of management has been fixed, and what they will get in terms of incentives will be closely related to the Tesco share price and the profit which the company generates as against, the sales or any other sales driven target. So here they are now mapping it against the overall aspects of how the organization is shaping up in terms of the market share, how it's doing in terms of profitability, the share price, the number of employees, their motivation, their levels of loyalty within the organization. So there have been in an inclusion of some let's put it this way, qualitative and quantitative objectives before the payout to the senior executive management can be done. Now, when we look at the functions into what Tesco would look at, they normally look at, from a strategic point of view, the HRM function is to look at building knowledge within the Tesco as an organization, and this is basically looking at, the Tesco Club Card program, if you put it this way. That program on the sales side brings in a lot of data, and that data is then put into use by the marketing department to be able to send out offers, promotions, and things like that, to its customers. Now, the HR policies are looking at providing, some of the best practices that needs to be adopted across the organization, and these best practices would then help in achievement of the corporate goal or the objective set by the management within the organization. Now, the SHRM side of things is also looking at, how the growth plan of the organization, because as it increases in terms of size or looks at internationally, international expansion, how this growth plan can be supported by the required staff and commensurate recruitment that needs to take place to get good employees which have sufficient skills to work within the organization. But at the same time, they are also looking at, a retention policy. That means they want to be able to retain the best talent within the organization. And in order to retain that talent, they are looking at, providing incentives, providing a better working environment, balance between work and personal life, in terms of ensuring that they are not being overworked, or they are able to work and get flexible working hours so that they are able to kind of, boost their productivity and efficiency while they work within a particular function within the organization. And then training and development side of things, which are a key, because this is an evolving field. So what they've decided is that training and development needs to be embraced, and as a company, they have a dedicated department within the organization which looks after developing employees. After the appraisals, they look at developing the employees in terms of their skills by providing training and development, which allows their employees to work more effectively, more productively within the organization. So training plans are put in place, and these training plans, when they are put in place, they are followed through by the different line managers, and there are appropriate financial resources put in place so that this process of training and development, which typically in an organization like Tesco happens throughout the year, can go on seamlessly without any hurdles. So the overall development of employees within the organization in Tesco is quite important, and that is one of the key strategic functions that the SHRM looks at focusing on when we look at an organization like Tesco, because if they have high staff and if they have high turnover, that means the business can get affected. So in order to retain the talent, in order to ensure that they have the right skill set and they are performing effectively and productively within the organization to help achieve the goals and objective, the strategic side of things looks at managing training and recruitment and selection, and also training and development hand in hand, so that they have lower staff turnover and the staff that they develop stay within the organization to be able to help achieve the objectives of the organization year on year. Now, some of the management practices, some of the policies and processes which are put in place, they then make sure that these have all the employees of the working staff have the same understanding on these policies and processes, and that is kind of dissipated through the training and development program. Now let's look at very briefly the last task in this particular learning outcome one, which is looking at the role of SHRM with regards to other functional areas within the organization. Now let's understand, so we discussed the functions of HR, and now let's understand what and how these functions are related to some of the other areas of the organization. Now, when I mentioned earlier that, one of the key things which is kind of driving, the strategic role of SHRM within organizations, or there is somebody now within the company in large organizations who looks after the HR strategy, is becoming a permanent function, or has become a permanent function in the last decade or two within the organizations, is because most organizations now have global operations. So because they have global operations, the HR side of things now need to be localized to different geographies or countries. And because they are working across in a different work environment, here the person needs to be able to kind of pick out some of the head office policies, but locally implement those policies in countries which match their laws and the local country law and legislation, so that they are effective in terms of implementation of these policies in that geography. The other reason that we look at would be the shortage of talent in developed countries. Sometimes you see a lot of countries allow people from other countries to come in through the highly skilled immigration program, or some sort of work permits or visas, because they have identified skill shortages, and these skill shortages are to be bridged, or are allowed to be filled in the private sector by employing people from outside a particular geography. So in the UK, it will be outside the EU, and if somebody comes in, can come in on a work permit, highly skilled immigration program, and other reasons, and in certain sectors which will be showing shortage of talent within the UK. Now, the third factor that we look at is sometimes large companies are also looking at outsourcing certain functions because of the cheaper cost of labor in emerging countries. So when we look at companies like H&M, Next, Marks and Spencer, you look at a lot of other companies which are in the clothing sector, in particular Primark, they have all outsourced manufacturing to developing countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, India, wherein China, wherein they definitely see the advantage of low-cost labor, being able to work on some of the operations which might not be very conducive and profitable within the UK. Now, one of the other factors that we also look at is technological processes. Now, technological processes, when we say, are to do with the fact that here what we are essentially looking at is, from a point of view of technological process, that you are looking at things which basically mean that the modernization of some of the basic things in terms of technology, machinery, is allowing now some of these outsourced operations to work in developing countries, because they can be better managed in terms of cost, but can also be remotely managed because of the use of technology. So when you look at things like cloud computing, you look at data warehousing, you can basically see that companies are increasingly employing databases which are based on cloud, because of the data being stored and available. This then allows some of the operations to be remotely managed, and remotely managed from a point of view of technological process, which allows them to bring in operational and cost efficiency within the organization. So employing of IT professionals which are responsible for running some of these operations remotely allows the organization to bring in operational efficiency using the use of technology within their manufacturing or operational processes. Now, what is the role of SHRM in this? When we look at with regards to other function, is that sometimes you will see that when human resources look at this as a function, they look at that they are a partner in hand with some of the other departments when some of these changes have to be implemented. So if you look at an example of Primark now looking at doing outsourced manufacturing in a country like Bangladesh with some of the suppliers, so HR is going to work very closely with engineering, production, marketing, business development, to be able to provide some of the processes which will work in the partner factories when the function is outsourced in terms of manufacturing in Bangladesh. So they will then look at implementing some of the main strategies of things like health and safety, providing fair wages to workers, providing and ensuring that the partner is able to comply with some of the quality policies, or the employment policies with regards to employing labor or workforce within that side of the geography, but working for Primark. But they have to then look at ensuring that some part of this is is basically translatable to a different country, and their working is done. Obviously, now their working is very close in hand in hand with some of the other departments to ensure that this implementation can happen. Sometimes you will see that they will have to work very closely with other departments to look at maybe say recruitment. So if there's an outsourced facility being created in a country like Bangladesh, and there will be somebody who will be overseeing operations. So recruitment and selection will have to be done, but the recruitment and selection will have to be done locally from that particular country, complying with the laws and legislation, the labor laws in particular. But the sales, the marketing side of things, or the operational head would have a key role in ensuring that the right person is recruited. So their role in terms of working with other departments is quite critical, and this is what we get to see when organizations are looking at having increasingly global operations. They are moving operations from developed countries to developing countries because of the cheaper cost available. Sometimes it is to do with the shortage of talent or manpower in a specific area, and because of which the HR has to then employ people from say abroad and things like that to be able to bring that talent in to bridge that vacancy. And last but not the least, technology is also enabling the use of some of these resources which can be used remotely, but there is training and development required for somebody who's going to be managing, say, the HR process. If there are, say, 200 workers employed by the factory, Primark, supplier factory in Bangladesh, but you will need to have somebody who's going to be, say, an HR manager who will manage, or the HR side of things in terms of department, which will manage the labor force working within that factory in terms of employee relations, in terms of insurance, in terms of employee welfare and things like that. So in general, when you look at the strategic side of functions here, is looking at the long-term objectives, and the long-term objectives from an HR point, marrying those business strategy long-term objectives with the HR side of functions to offer a way forward, wherein they are looking at basically encompassing the traditional HR functions of recruiting, selection, things like that, but also looking at how HR can successfully contribute towards achieving the overall objectives of organizational strategy, which most companies now look at when we look at the role of SHRM. So and I'm going to stop here at this moment, but what we've done in this particular session is primarily looked at the first learning outcome. And in this first learning outcome, what we've kind of looked at is that we've covered the learning outcome 1, which basically is to understand the role of SHRM, and then some of the assessment criteria, which is looking at task 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3. Now, in order for you to develop a bit more deeper understanding and reading into this subject, I'm going to be sending a bit of a handout, which is on the models of HRM, and also a bit of a handout for learning outcome 1, which is an extract from a book which will help you to crystallize some of the concepts that we've discussed, in these slides today. I hope you've enjoyed this session, and if there are any further questions and queries, please feel free to either email me or note them down so we can discuss that in the next session. Thanks very much for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.